of the things that you may have seen me doing in the last video, and something that came up earlier on in the series was adjustment layers. We're going to very quickly go through the adjustment layers in not too much detail, just enough so that you understand what they're there for and how some of them work. So the first thing that we need to understand is that, similar to normal layers, which we've worked with earlier on in the lessons, they do not actually physically change the original image. They are adjustment layers, they go over the top. Now if you think about how a gel filter would work when you put a gel filter over a picture, say for example if I was to put a red filter over this image, it would all appear red, albeit different varying degrees of red, and some colours would even appear to be indistinguishable from others because they are the same on the red spectrum. And the same way we can do that using adjustment layers. Think of it as an acetate sheet that goes over the top of your original image, which applies an effect of some description or another. For example, using this menu up here in the adjustments layer tab, you can see that we've got all of these quick shortcuts to all of the adjustment layers that you can create. Now the other way we can reach those layers is by going in through the layer, and then we can go to new, and then you'll see adjustment layer is, new adjustment layer is here, my part. So all of those options are also available here, but I tend to just use this option up here because it's quicker. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply the brightness and contrast adjustment layer. Now when I first apply it, you can see that nothing actually happens up here. All we see is that we've now jumped to the properties tab, which is now populated with the adjustment for this particular adjustment layer, and there's also a second button which is allows us to apply the mask, but we'll go over to the properties for now. So what I generally do when I'm using an adjustment layer is I will apply the filter to the entire image, and then I will invert the mask and then paint it in where I want to, because I'm, for example, going to increase the contrast in her hair. So I'm looking, I can see the whole image, the adjustments apply to the whole image, but I'm actually concentrating on looking at the hair and getting it to where I want it to be. So I don't want it to be so bright, I want it to be a bit darker, but I also want there to be more contrast because I want the shapes to be more visible. So I've applied these controls, I've increased the contrast quite a bit, and I've reduced the brightness by a reasonable amount, but that's now applied to the entire image. So I'm going to come down to the layers tab like this. I've selected the layer mask and I'm going to hit Control I to invert the layer mask, and you'll notice now that the effect has been removed, but I've got a black layer mask. So I can now use my paintbrush tool, make sure that I'm on white, set my opacity to, I'm going to go with about 50%, only because I want to feather the edges slightly. So I'm going to apply one coat. Now it doesn't really matter if you go over the edge in the white high key background, because obviously the contrast between black and white is the contrast between black and white, so you're not going to make a huge amount of difference around there, but obviously you need to be quite careful around this area here that you don't apply the effect to the skin as well, because that will make her skin look very odd. So now I'm just going to go over it one more time, maybe one more time, there we go, yes, that's what I want. And that's the brightness and contrast adjustment layer. If you look at the layer mask, you can now see where I have applied that effect. So we'll come back up to here and we're going to reactivate the adjustments tab, and we're going to look at what other options we have available. There are levels, which are very good for photographs. There is the curves adjustment layer, which is also very handy. Exposure, vibrance, hue and saturation, color balance, black and white, photo filters, channel mixer, color lookup, invert, polarize, threshold, selective color, and gradient map. Now we're not going to do all of these in this video. I'm going to choose a couple just to show you what the power of Photoshop will allow us to do. So I'm going to show you an effect which I absolutely despise, but I'm going to do it for you. So that shows how much I love you. I'm going to hit the selective color. Now what we can see here is that we have a color drop down which allows us to change the hue and saturation of each individual color, and we can change for example, at the moment I've got red selected, so I'm actually changing the color properties of the reds in the picture. I can make them, now obviously there's quite a lot of red in this image because of obviously her lipstick, her nails, and most skin tones have a certain amount of red in them as well, so that's making quite a lot of difference. So I'm going to reduce that a little bit, and I'm going to choose a colour that's perhaps a little bit less prevalent in the image, and we're going to go with magentas. Magentas, as you can see, there's a little bit around her eyes. There's going to still be some changes to the skin tones here, I would imagine, but not as much. So I can actually change, see, it's not actually making a huge amount of difference to the skin tone, so I can actually change the saturation level of her makeup. So I can make her makeup really quite vibrant, and I can reduce it so that it's almost grey in appearance, and you can play around with these values until to your heart's content. So you can almost completely remove her eye makeup from the picture just by reducing the saturation levels of the colours in the image, and then we can also, there you go, so that's almost completely removed her eye makeup from the picture. Now with any layer, if you want to remove it, if you don't like the effect that you've applied, you can select it down in the layers panel and just simply hit the delete key and it will go. Failing that, you can drag it down into the dustbin, and there it is, it's gone. So we're going to look at one last adjustment layer, which is the hue and saturation layer. Now you have again a drop down menu here which will allow you to select individual colors, but what we can do is you can use the master channel to reduce the saturation of the entire image, which would obviously give you a black and white. Now all this does is desaturate. It does not change the contrast of any particular image or any particular section of the image, so if you want to make more fine-tuning adjustments to the black and white, then you can obviously use the black and white adjustment layer. Now what we can also do is we can select the reds, and you can just drag the saturation. You can remove the yellows or increase the yellows in the image like so. Now as you can see, there's a lot of yellows in the image, so by reducing the saturation you can change the image like so. And now the final control, which we're going to go back to the master, is the lightness, and you can increase or decrease the amount of lightness in the image. Now that affects the RGB values across the board, which means that you're not changing the exposure, you're simply changing the brightness of the image. You're increasing the lightness of the shadows, you're decreasing the brightness of the highlights. And finally we also have the colorize button. Now what this does is it applies the color of your selection along the color picker at the top here to the entire image. Remember that color gel that I was talking to you about before? This is how you apply a very basic effect to the entire image. So you can go through the color range and find a color that you actually like. I personally don't tend to use this effect very much, but it's there if you want to do it. And that, ladies and gents, is the power of adjustment layers.